The 13th century, perhaps the happiest of all centuries for Christendom. It was the age of knights in shining armour, of wandering minstrels, of high days and holidays. Yet there was a series of mortal attacks on Christendom from the Mongols, the Muslims, and the Albigensians. But there were three famous saints of the 13th century: St. Dominic, St. Francis of Assisi, and St. Thomas Aquinas. St. Dominic was the intellectual. He spread the devotion of the Rosary as a safeguard of the faith. St. Francis of Assisi was the other part of the Catholic faith, and one of the most lovable and poetic of saints, who taught the love of lady poverty and of simplicity. And St. Thomas Aquinas was a Dominican, a great intellectual in the Dominican order which St. Dominic had begun. He wrote, among other things, the Summa Theologica, counted as the second most important book after the Bible, explaining every detail of the faith and answering all objections. In the 13th century, all educated men throughout Christendom could speak Latin, and all kings shared the same faith, acknowledging the kingship of Christ and the spiritual leadership of the Pope. Richard the Lionheart, King of England, was a leader of the Third Crusade, which achieved a truce that allowed Christian pilgrims the right to enter Jerusalem. And then, unfortunately, at the beginning of the 13th century, on the 13th of April 1204, during the Fourth Crusade, the Crusaders sacked the great city of Constantinople, looting and burning. Now, there was a reason for it. They didn't just storm straight into it, but we won't go into all the details. But one of the leaders of the Fourth Crusade, Simon de Montfort, refused to take part in the attack against their supposed allies and returned to France, and the Pope excommunicated those who had taken part. The sack of Constantinople ended any possibility of healing the quarrel between Constantinople and Rome. Meanwhile, Eastern Europe was overrun by the pagan nomadic Mongols, who halted the development of civilization in Russia for centuries. And in the south of France, the Albigensian heresy took root. It was seen as a mortal attack on the fabric of society. Members of the sect were free to indulge in any vice, marriage was condemned, suicide was encouraged. Yet the leaders were often seen to be living more ordered and praiseworthy lives than many Catholic prelates, who were becoming rich and worldly. This has happened again and again in history. The attempt to stamp out the heresy by the sword was unsuccessful. It was St. Dominic who was successful. He went from town to town, preaching and then praying the Holy Rosary. He would preach on each of the mysteries of the Rosary, for instance, and then he would invite people to join him. During the course of the 13th century, the descendants of the Normans in England were taking on. During the course of the 13th century, the descendants of the Normans in Ireland took on Irish customs and language, and soon as the Irish envoys sourly reported back in disgust, they were more Irish than the Irish themselves.